Let me start by thanking the ERF and, in particular, Ahmed Galal for inviting me to this conference. I've been a great admirer of the ERF for a number of years, but this is my first time here. So I'm glad that at least I overlapped with you, Ahmed, in this. It's an honor for me to be here on this distinguished panel and to talk about the transition area. Now, I'll start off by pulling off from something what Hafiz talked about, which was that essentially economic factors were a very important issue in the uprisings that took place starting in January 2011. Now, you wouldn't believe that if you looked at just the media and or the press and in that thing, because there the emphasis has been very strongly on the political issues. If you ask somebody what was the Arab Spring, if they're not an economist, they would say, well, basically, it was a wish to put these countries, a wish by the citizens of these countries, to put these countries on a path of political openness and pluralism and democracy. But indeed, I think over the last few years, it's been clear that economic factors played a very significant role in the uprisings themselves. Unfortunately, over the past 4 years, since the beginning of these uprisings, economic issues took a backseat to politics. The lack of attention to economic issues was primarily because people were interested, though governments were interested in tackling or addressing political issues and political problems that arose, and with the intention somehow that once these political issues were resolved, hopefully quickly, they were not, but hopefully quickly, then they would turn their attention to the economic issues. I think it's fair to conclude that in the Arab transition countries, the governments were really late in realizing that political stability is very difficult to achieve if your economies are in turmoil. And I think this two-way causation was misunderstood. And to some extent, it's now, there is a realization now, but it's still been slow in coming. So you have the Arab Spring transition issue, and what I'd like to talk about in my talk is essentially economic development since the 2011 uprisings. Then I'll turn to economic policies, talk about the role of the international community and the IMF, since that's my background, and then finally conclude with what lies ahead. And that, hopefully, Ahmed, will feed into your next plenary of what lies ahead. So let me start with the shocks that took place. This is 2011, and this is just a caricature of what was going on in 2011. You had, of course, social unrest and political change taking place in each of the countries. You had high oil prices at that time. You had slow global growth, and you had the European financial crisis at the same time. And then, of course, you had regional spillovers, countries that were close together. Once their economies started to falter, it spilled over into other countries. So in a sense, what I would call, this created what is a perfect storm for these countries, Arab transition countries. And you then had this perfect storm having a very adverse impact on growth, because growth, as I will show, started to fall from 2011. Unemployment, as Hafiz has said, and as everyone knows, started to rise since 2011, even though it was high to start with in 2010. Beyond that, it started to rise. You had impacts on inflation. Inflation was higher as a result of it. You had a sharp deterioration in external balances when the countries started to lose reserves, international reserves. And finally, you had basically a situation where the all the economies were, in a sense, hit hard and were on the path of deterioration. And what in fact happened is clear from this chart. You had economic growth. I'm now comparing economic growth in 6 Arab transition countries, which are basically Egypt, Jordan, Libya, Morocco, Tunisia, and Yemen, and then comparing them with MENA as a whole. And if you can, as you can see, they were doing reasonably well in the decade of 2000 to 2010, and then a sharp decline in 2011, and then a slow rise, but I'll come in and discuss that in more detail. I should also point out that I'm just looking at growth here, and so I don't want to shy away from saying, we just look at the macro growth here. What the uprising did, and has been pointed out by so many very smart people, economists even sitting around here in this room, what the perfect storm did was it really exposed the major structural fault lines in these economies. And these had been masked over by the relatively good macro performance. So you had good macro performance, reasonably good macro performance, but there were major problems underneath in these economies. And once growth started to fall and macroeconomic conditions deteriorated, those got exposed. And what were these structural fault lines? Well, we know them all. There was sort of high rates of unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, and I'll come back to that. There was a perception and some reality of widespread and rampant corruption in the operation of these countries. Crony capitalism that benefited essentially the family and close associates of the rulers. You had disparities in economic development between urban centers and rural areas, widening income and wealth inequalities, along with rising poverty rates at the same time. You had a large and growing informal economy. And this was an issue that was very, very easily exposed when you come to the unemployment issue. An inadequate and aging infrastructure and cumbersome regulations, red tape, enforced by a large and inefficient government bureaucracy. I mean, the list can go on and on and on, so I will not belabor that. But we come to what actually was going on, and you can see, now you've got past the aggregates and looking at the countries individually that are there, and you can see virtually all the Arab transition countries' economies floundered over the past 4 years. Economic growth fell sharply in all of them. Essentially in Egypt, the largest economy in the group, which has a nominal GDP of around $250 billion, growth fell to less than 2% from over 5% in the previous year. This is in 2011. The picture was broadly similar for Jordan as well, where the growth rate fell to 2.5% from an average of about 6% over the previous decade. In the following 3 years, growth rates in the Arab transition countries did stabilize in some sense, but they stabilized at a very low level, and they stabilized at 2.5% of growth rates, as compared to 4.5% in the decade up to 2010. So this low growth equilibrium is bad. Obviously, it's a bad thing, but one of the biggest problems is that a growth rate of this magnitude, this low magnitude, is not sufficient to absorb the new entrants that come into the labor force, let alone make any dent on the stock of the unemployed that exists. So just keeping the unemployment rate where it is, this growth rate is not enough. And so we then move on to something that again, Hafiz and other people have talked about. Look at unemployment rates in that period. And I'm looking at 2001, 11, 12, and 13. And it's very clear that the period that you talked about, Hafiz, was before the thing. This is going on since then. So if anything, the picture is getting worse in these countries. So I think the governments in all these countries, they realized that unemployment was a serious issue and spoke about it. But what can you do? They said tackling unemployment has to be one of our highest priorities. But the problem, of course, is that jobs can't be created out of thin air. I mean, you say, I want to create jobs, but you can't create them out of thin air because, improving the education system, say, to eliminate the skills mismatch between the workers that are the university graduates or school graduates and what the private sector wants in terms of qualifications, there's a skills mismatch, and that requires changing the education system. This is a long-term proposition. Increasing private businesses through infrastructure development, increasing them so that they would create more jobs, and streamlining business regulations so that they will hire more workers, of course, is, again, not something that can be done overnight. It takes a long time to do. So what is the only way to create jobs quickly in these countries? Well, the government. I mean, the government is the only agency in these countries, in developing countries in general, but in these countries, that can in fact create jobs out of thin air, because they can expand employment, and indeed they did. That's exactly what happened in 2011, 2012. That governments in most of these countries added to the labor force, added government employment. And it's understandable that they did that. I mean, one can be critical of it, but the choices were very limited. There was no other way of creating jobs. So that really is something. You have a situation where, as I've said, things started to deteriorate in 2011, and that kept on going until now, almost. And the situation we have not got back to pre-2010 days in virtually all these countries. So that's so much for the actual developments and the first part of what I was talking about. So the second part is economic policies. What economic policies these governments followed? Well, as I said at the beginning, the preoccupation of these governments was with the political issues, and economics was secondary. Whether these political issues were of their own making or they were reacting, politics was dominant in the first part. The second, I think there is an important issue that sometimes is not fully appreciated. It's that the Arab countries that we're talking about, Arab countries in general, but in these particular Arab countries, they had no economic model to aspire to. They had no economic model in mind. There were two models that were, I'm being sort of simplistic in this, there were really two models out there that were, there was a statist, government-controlled model, and then there was the other model, which was the sort of free market reform model which allowed the private sector to play a very important role in there were these two. One can call, I mean, for the sake of argument, one can call one the status model and the other a sort of a neoliberal model. These two models were out there. Now, take the example of Egypt, where Egypt moved from the statist to a more of a neoliberal model during the last, I would say, during the Ahmed Nazif government of the last 5 years of the Hosni Mubarak regime. So the government moved towards that. And in other countries, similarly, reforms were undertaken in Tunisia and Morocco and Jordan, etc. Whether with the IMF or in the World Bank or without them, they headed in this direction. But what the uprisings did was in fact discredit that particular model. So now you had a situation where the status model had been discredited before as not the right way to develop. Nobody was developing that way. Now the neoliberal model was under criticism, so you had to look for a third or a different model, and there was none. This is quite different when people say, well, how did the European transition countries manage? Well, they had an economic model. They had an economic model imposed, in a sense, on them by the European Union that says, you do A, B, C, D, and we will give you financing, and we will give you the opportunity to join the European Union. So we'll give you financing, incentive, etc. Take all the hard reform steps, and you'll do that. So the Arab countries did not have that. So it was unclear where they would go and what kind of model they would have. Absent having a model or an economic plan or what type of model to have, they went on this sort of reactive economic policies. It became firefighting. It became day-to-day management of the economy. And you had pressures on you to undertake populist policies. On you meaning the government had these pressures. I mean, they had to cater to a restive population that had been in the streets, that felt empowered. They wanted something, and so how you wanted to give it to them in some way as a government. And what did you do? Well, you increased subsidies to start with. We're talking about 2011, 2012, and the early years of the uprising. You gave, as I said earlier, you increase government employment to employ people. You increase wages to make people sort of feel that, that they were getting something. And all of this combined, you engaged in expansionary fiscal policies, which expanded the deficits, fiscal deficits of these countries. I'm not necessarily saying that as a criticism. There were pressures on governments to undertake expansionary fiscal policies. You can call it fiscal stimulus or whatever, a nicer word than just expansionary fiscal policies.
You know that I'm going to disagree with you on this, right? You know that I'm going to disagree with you on this, right?
You know what?
No, it's okay.
But he will disagree.
That you disagree with me. Yes. No, we've had this argument. We've had this discussion before on the fiscal stimulus. I was actually quoting you when I said fiscal stimulus because that's the term you used with me. Anyway, so what happened with fiscal balances? As you can see over the period, that this is the state of this is the deficit of the government of the countries, and Egypt during the time before 2010 had a fiscal deficit of a little over 8%, and that steadily increased for the reasons I've just given you. There was, in 2014, there was a decline in the fiscal deficit that had to do with the removal of some subsidies when one of the members of a panel was also in the cabinet of the Egyptian government. But in all the other countries, you can see the fiscal deficits, in a sense, kept on rising. And in Tunisia is a good example of, where a very tight fiscal policy in 2010, relatively speaking, with a minuscule deficit, has, went up to 6% by 2013. 6% deficit, 6% of GDP. So that's the sort of, to some extent, the populism, to some extent, removal of subsidies, government employment, fiscal stimulus, all these factors led to this kind of fiscal outcome for these countries. Then, what was the role of the international community? This is my third part, and well, we started off, just in the sort of aftermath of the heyday of the Arab Spring. You got this so-called Deauville Partnership, and in the Deauville Partnership, you had all the countries coming around, and it was a pledging conference. In these pledging conferences, they pledged $40 billion. $40 billion. There's, as my colleagues who were around familiar with these issues, these pledging conferences involve, the double counting of money you've already committed, and you're counting on others to provide funding, etc. But they wound up with a figure of 40 billion. How much of that has been delivered? Well, it depends. I mean, on one hand, some people are very skeptical and say hardly any has been delivered. Other people say, well, given that, for example, the GCC was already promising 10 to 15 billion in this 40 billion, well, they've delivered. And they've over-delivered. So they, in a sense, they have received the money. The EU and the US provided very limited financing. They promised a lot. They have provided, in the last 4 years, very little financing to the government. So the big financing for some of these countries, in particular Egypt, has come from the Gulf. I mean, it's the Gulf countries that have been the large providers of bilateral financing and have continued to do so. They also have an annual agreement with Jordan, and they provide financing to Jordan from that. But it's relative to Egypt, it's very small. Then finally, you have the IFIs. And the IFIs, which the fund, the World Bank, EBRD, African Development Bank, Islamic Development Bank, all of them have provided funding to many countries in the thing. In the case of, a focus on the one that I know, which is in the case of the IMF, well, the IMF had very quickly in 2012, it had programs with Jordan and then with Morocco. Those were the first two programs negotiated in 2012. In Jordan, the IMF provided a loan of $2 billion. For Morocco, they committed to provide initially $6.2 billion, but it's a precautionary loan in the sense that Morocco would only use it if it needed to use it, and indeed it never needed to use it, and so it didn't. And that has just been renewed as well. The newer one was in 2014 for another $5 billion. So it's a line of credit that you can draw on if you need to. In the case of Jordan, they are negotiating, and they've completed negotiations on another program as well. For Tunisia got 1.78 billion from the IMF, and the current status is that the negotiations are almost complete or for much longer. And so they have their programs are continuing with Jordan, Morocco, and Tunisia. Yemen, they had a program, but it's now off track. Obviously, it's on hold for the two. In Egypt, there have been these, each time you get an issue, in 2011, there was supposed to be a program for 3 billion. It went up to 4.8 billion, which was negotiated in 2013, and at the very last minute, it fell through. And the Egyptians decided not to proceed with it. And every now and then, there are noises that will they go for an IMF program, won't they go for an IMF program? We don't know. I've stopped predicting that they would. Because, how many years can you say next year they'll have a program? But it's having, so let me just come to, very quickly, I won't dwell on this at all. One of the big issues in these countries from a regulatory standpoint, these are the latest figures on business climate rankings for the various countries. And as you can see, many of these countries on these business climate don't do very well in terms of their ranking. And this is something they will have to do. The last but one, which actually I won't go into because I think this goes into the next plenary, which is what are the kind of reforms one would think that these countries would need. I'm trying here to sort of, in some sense, develop a model that will try and meet the objectives that people have for these countries of the inclusive growth and reduction in wealth and income inequalities, etc. There's a lot of difficulty in coming up with a model that will achieve all these objectives, and particularly since I really have a tough time in being able to think concretely in terms of operationalizing this idea of inclusive growth. This is the sort of list that one could use. And let me just then conclude with, this is what the picture looks like for growth in 2015, 2016. And as you can see, I mean, I've subtracted Libya and Yemen, obviously, from the list. And this is sort of I would say, a consensus forecast. IMF, World Bank, and others have come up with a consensus. And you're still stuck at the sort of between 3 and 4%, and closer to 3 growth, even in 2016. So, finally, what lies ahead? Well, the first order of business I think is still macroeconomic stabilization and getting your public finances right in some way, and reducing those deficits that I pointed out were climbing. You have to tackle the external balances and increase foreign reserves. Every country knows that, and they're trying to their utmost to do that, to improve the thing. I think one of the things that one is often overlooked in this search for higher growth is that, people immediately focus on, you need new investments, you need new financing, and that's all very true for the long run. But my point here is that there are ways that you can just increase capacity utilization in existing industries. Many industries, for example, in Egypt, heavy industry is operating at 50 to 60% capacity. And the main reason it's doing that is energy shortages. So all I'm saying is that, look, with the same level of capital, physical capital, you were able to grow at 6 and 7% pre-2010. Okay? Why can't you get back to that rate of growth now by increasing capacity utilization, even allowing for some deterioration in the physical capital stock? So that's one point. I think it's the reasons for capacity utilization being low: input shortages I just mentioned, energy shortages, imported input shortages. That's because of the external balances issue, which we can see every day here. Labor problems. I mean, you have an empowered unions that create, and you have labor issues. These have to be sorted out so you can get a quick turnaround in the economy and a quick increase in the growth rate. And finally, I mean, I just say, I mean, structural reforms, that's for the next plenary session. I mean, the fundamental issues are very simple. I mean, you have to create jobs, yes. But you have to generate investments, both domestic and foreign investments into your countries, into these countries, and you have to compete in a globalized world. Thank you very much.